Some of the most beautiful invertebrates you've ever seen might be extinct in the wild, but thriving in captivity. Could we as hobbyists actually be the last hope for these species? I want to go over a few different subjects today, whether it be why they're disappearing or how the hobby can save some of these species and has shown so, to the various ethical gray areas that we come across as a hobbyist, to how you can help. There's various ways we can go over all of these. I'm going to go a bit in depth into each one. So, as far as why they're disappearing, we're looking at various things like habitat destruction, pesticide use, climate change, and more adversely, because of our hobby, over collection to sustain our passions. Isopods often have extremely limited ranges. Some live on single hillsides and caves. The microhabitats like rotting logs, leaf litters, and specific humidity zones make them especially vulnerable to land use for housing development, highways, whatever it may be. Prime examples that have been adversely affected from forest loss and things like that would be the Poecilothera metallica. Their status from the population basis is critically endangered due to deforestation in the very tiny native range in India that they're from. Another one from that same family, Poecilothera smithii, also endangered. They're found in a very limited area of Sri Lanka. But then we run into things like Brachypelma. A lot of them are under habitat destruction, as well as you run into factors like overcollection for our hobby. A lot of them are now non-exported anymore from the wild populations, so the price is exponentially increased. Merlinella species pink lambo. In the hobby, we assume that they're extinct to critically endangered. There isn't any actual scientific data on this yet. It's all speculation, but that would be due to overcollection again for our greed and our demand as hobbyists. Because although there is no formal conservation assessment done currently, I'm sure in the near future we'll find out that they are potentially gone and we're the only ones left with them in the hobby. Another perfect example from the isopod side of things is Porcilio bolivari. It's a fan favorite amongst hobbyists. They're absolutely stunning, but they're originally from a very limited mountainside range in Spain. They're critically endangered in the wild due to urbanization again and habitat destruction. They've been highlighted occasionally in European conservation discussions. Some Merlinella, cubaris, and even Armadillidae species, especially color morphs from Southeast Asia or the Pacific Islands, may already be functionally extinct in their natural habitat because they're collected to the point of extinction prior to proper identification. So these species may not be known to science before vanishing in the wild, sadly. Next part I want to touch in on is how our hobby has saved species. You have things like the Metallicas, Porcilothera metallica, thriving in captive collections, multiple captive red lines. They're one of the most popular blue tarantulas around. Then you have Lucanus beetles, whether it be Lucanus placidus, like I have in a featured video that I did earlier on the channel, or other various species. They're all threatened due to habitat loss. But thankfully, in Europe and Japan, they may not be as popular in North America due to the laws and bylaws and things like that, so they're harder to obtain or harder to keep. But in Japan and Europe, they're very popular in the hobby and in the industry. Brachypelma, another one. This also covers Tilitocati, which I'm pretty sure I'm enunciating wrong, but those species are now heavily bred in the hobby, taking a lot of strain off of wild collection and that demand. There's things like the Lord Howe island stick insects. They were extinct in the wild until rediscovery, but now they're still critically endangered. This one doesn't exist in the hobby, sadly, but the Melbourne Zoo has a captive breeding program for them, hopefully going to reintroduce them to the wild down the road. Partula snails. I've never worked with them myself. They're just a species that came up in my research, but they're very much, there's several species of them extinct in the wild because they're commonly from fragile island-based ecosystems. And as we know, as soon as we start to urbanize these islands, we generally eradicate everything. Look at the dodo, for instance. But again, zoos and hobbyists have actually come together with captive breeding programs, and they're still sustaining several species that are extinct in the wild within captive enclosure, well, captive keeping, I guess is the best term to put that with. But not only does this affect animals as a whole to bring them back from the brink of extinctions, you get things like Armadillidium maculatum or zebra isopods or Porcellinoides pernosus, where we get a lot of captive color morphs that aren't existing in the wild, like high whites or yellow zebras. Those aren't wild morphs. Those are only in captive collections. So it shows a lot of domestication within these species, sort of like what we've done in other industries, reptiles and fish, ball pythons, for instance, with all the mutations and color genetics that are followed with those. Captive breeding is currently the only insurance policy for many of these species, especially when formal conservation isn't involved, which is very common for invertebrates, sadly. The next part I'd like to touch on are the ethical gray areas. It's a touchy subject, for sure, and we as hobbyists need to be aware of where a lot of these animals that we keep come from. A lot of Cubaris were directly exported from their country of origins, sadly. Merlinella is the same thing, but now they've disappeared. There's no more in the wild. You can't find them like you could before. But that's where greed comes into play, in my opinion. Hobbyists or collectors in this base collect everything to the point of extinction because they want to make a quick buck. Because the new and exciting are the next best thing, and that's how you can fetch the highest amount of money. But the problem with things like this, where we've now extinct or put these animals to extinct in the wild, is we're going to start running into genetic bottlenecks, where you only have a limited supply of them, so the genetic diversity isn't there, creating weaker strains, weaker animals, prone to disease or mutations. And not just, mutations don't only come in fantastic color morphs like you see with like the yellow zebras or the high whites. You can run into things where they're going to be prone to bacterial infections, fungal infections. They don't develop properly. Maybe their gills are improper, and they randomly start dying. And that's the issue. Collectors, honestly, in my opinion, often bring these in to the hobby without any scientific description. And habitats are rapidly lost to deforestation and development. So we have animals in the hobby. We see it on a regular basis as far as isopods go, where reclassifications come into play. Tarantulas are no different. They're less common for reclassifications, but they're generally identified prior to becoming a mainstream thing in the hobby, thankfully. And this doesn't mean that I'm only discussing these specific set animals. It's just animals that I'm more familiar with myself. The next topic I'd like to talk about is going to be what you can do, what we can do as a hobbyist, as a whole. If possible, make sure your animals that you're purchasing from that breeder that messaged you on Facebook or Instagram or whatever it may be, make sure that they're a legitimate breeder and the animals that they're selling are captive bred and not potentially wild collected or poached, because that's a massively negative impact on the industry, on the wild population as a whole. One thing that I disagree with, that I find super common, especially in the isopod industry, is care tips and acknowledging sharing of how to maintain things isn't very common. A lot of people bicker and fight. I really wish we could all come together, share knowledge, share awareness. If something's doing great for one person but poorly for another, how about we help each other at the end of the day? One of the major things that I wish we could do a lot more of, and I would love to see, is collaboration between hobbyists and researchers. Sure, we may not have a fancy lab coat, which I should have worn mine for this video, or beakers and test vials and sterile environments, but we are our own form of researchers. Just because we don't write everything down, I keep a journal on how certain bugs do for me if I've only recently gotten them, to make sure that I'm doing things properly. Sharing information like that with researchers could bring us more together as a hobby and help out overall the bugs that we're looking to maintain and we all enjoy so much. The last subject that I'm very leery on is reintroduction. Reintroductions aren't very common, on the basis that you can reintroduce, let's say we want to reintroduce pink lambos into their wild habitat. Maybe there's something else that has now filled that niche. Or worse yet, maybe our captive strains are carrying a pathogen that they've grown disease resistant to, but wild isopods can't or aren't. So then we kill off another species indirectly by accident. There's other things like the stick insects. Their reintroduction was successful. Partula snails, some species have been reintroduced to the fragile island ecosystems that they come from naturally. But some species have host-specific specialties for diets. So if that plant dies, what are you going to do? You can't reintroduce them without a food source. Doesn't make much sense. Hopefully one day, we may be able to develop our own Noah's Arks of colonies for some of these species that have gone extinct in the wild, whether it be rubber duckies or pink lambo isopods, things like that. Maybe we can reintroduce them from the hobbyist point of view and help to get more acknowledgement and potential conservation for these species, because even though they're small, they should still be looked at as part of the bigger picture, in my opinion. If you keep any oddball animals that you feel are needing conservation efforts, or if you're working with them just because you're passionate, drop them down in the comments.